Hey loves, and welcome back to Lynn's Place, the space where we talk about faith, identity, and the quiet work of becoming. Today we're talking about early retirement, the dream so many of us work toward, the finish line we imagine will finally bring peace. But what happens when you arrive and instead of relief, it feels like a crisis? This episode is called Retired at 35, Now What? I thought retirement meant freedom. More time, more space, less pressure. Instead, it felt like I was free falling. No meetings on my calendar, no deadlines were waiting for me, no title to introduce myself with. And beneath that gratitude was a quiet unease. I had spent so much of my life being productive that I didn't know how to just be. I didn't expect rest to feel so uncomfortable. I didn't expect stillness to ask me so many questions. For years, my worth had been measured by what I accomplished, how busy I was, how needed I felt, how much I could carry. Being useful had become my identity. I didn't realize how tightly I had tied who I was to what I did. When that structure disappeared, so did the version of myself I had grown accustomed to. Suddenly, I was just retired. I felt unearthed. Like I had stepped off of a moving train and was standing in a wide open field, unsure which direction to walk. This wasn't just about leaving work. It was about learning how to exist without earning my worth. I was grateful. However, gratitude and grief can sit side by side. I was mourning a version of myself while trying to make space for the new one. Retirement didn't feel like an ending. It felt like exposure. Stripping away titles, routines, and roles until I was left with the deeper question. Who am I when I am no longer needed in the same way? For so long, my purpose had been clear. Show up, perform, provide, produce. There was always a next thing, a next role, a next title that told me, you matter. You're doing enough. But in retirement, the titles disappear. There was no performance review, no paycheck that validated my contribution, no professional title that explained me in 2 or 3 words. And in that silence, I had to sit with myself in a way I never really had before. I began to see that my identity had been shaped by the world's rhythm, its urgency, its expectations, its constant more. I moved at its pace for years, rarely stopping long enough to ask whether the pace was mine. Retirement slowed everything down, and in that slowing down, things I had buried started to resurface. Questions like, what am I here for? What gives my life meaning if I don't have this job? What parts of me were true and what parts were just molded to fit my role? I had to confront the uncomfortable truth. I had mistaken activity for purpose. I had confused being needed for being known. And yet, beneath this discomfort was something sacred, an invitation. An invitation to rediscover myself. Beyond titles, beyond productivity, beyond expectations. But not to return to who I was before. Not to recreate the version of me that knew exactly where she belonged and what she was good at. This invitation was different. It was asking me to meet the woman I had become after leaving something I loved. After closing a chapter that had shaped me, stretched me, and held so much of my identity for 14 years. An invitation to grieve what was lost, the routines, the familiarity, the sense of being known, without letting the grief convince me that the best parts of me were left behind. It was an invitation to sit with quiet questions. Who am I when the role is gone, but the heart is still full? To notice what remained when the job no longer named me. What values stayed. What strengths softened instead of disappeared. What parts of me were still alive even without a place to pour them into. Yet. It wasn't being asked to rebuild the old version of me. It was being asked to trust the unfolding of a new one. A version that's shaped not by performance, but by presence. Not by being needed, but by being known. First by God, and slowly again by myself. This invitation required patience. Because rediscovering yourself after leaving a place you love doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. In pauses. In moments when you realize you're not who you were, but you're not lost either. And maybe that was the truest work of this season. The learning that identity isn't erased when a chapter ends. It's revealed differently. After 14 years of building, giving, growing, and being shaped by work that mattered deeply to me, I realized that my purpose wasn't ending when I retired. And in that quiet unraveling, I realized something I had never really practiced before. I realized how often I invited God into my doing, but not always into my being. I trusted Him with my work, my effort, my striving, my productivity, but rest required a different kind of faith. Rest required surrender. It meant believing that my life still had meaning even when I wasn't accomplishing something visible. That my identity was still secure even when no one needed anything from me. That I was still called, still held, still becoming, even in the quiet. And maybe that's where this season gently turns towards you. If you've ever stepped away from something you loved, a job, a role, a season, a version of yourself, and wondered who you were without it, you're not alone. If the rest has felt uncomfortable instead of restoring, if the quiet has stirred questions you didn't know how to answer, if you caught yourself wondering, who am I when there's nothing to prove, fix, or produce? This space was never meant to overwhelm you. It was meant to meet you. Because when the doing slows down, it doesn't mean God is disappointed or distant. It often means He's inviting you closer. Not to perform, not to strive, but to be known. God doesn't measure your life by output. He doesn't withdraw when the work ends. He stays. And sometimes seasons like this aren't about losing purpose at all. They're about learning that your identity was never fragile to begin with. So if you're not who you used to be, and you're not quite sure who you're becoming yet, maybe this isn't the end of your purpose. Maybe it's the place where it finally begins to root deeper. Not in what you do, but in who you are. And even here, in the quiet, and in the between, you still have purpose. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about purpose after work. Not as a checklist or a second act to hustle toward, but as a deeper alignment between who you are and who you're becoming. Because maybe purpose isn't always about what we do. Maybe sometimes it's about who we allow ourselves to be when the doing finally stops. And maybe this season, this slower, quieter, unstructured space isn't empty at all. Maybe it's sacred ground. Because for so many of us, purpose was never just about what we did. It was about who we believe we were allowed to be. First, identity tied to productivity. Many of us learned early that worth was measured by output, by accomplishments, by how much we could carry, fix, produce, or provide. Being busy became a badge of honor. Being needed felt like proof that we mattered. So when the work ends, whether through retirement, burnout, illness, or transition, it's not just the schedule that changes. The identity shakes. We're left asking questions we were too busy to ask before. If I'm not producing, am I still valuable? If I'm not needed in the same way, who am I now? Secondly, the guilt of not working. Even when rest is earned, it can feel undeserved. We rest, but with explanation. We slow down, but with apology. We pause, but with a quiet sense of shame. And this weight lands more heavy for women, even heavier for Black women. We've been taught to be strong, dependable, resilient, to carry more and complain less, to keep going even when our bodies and our spirits are asking us to stop. So choosing rest can feel rebellious, like we're breaking an unspoken rule, like we need permission to lay down what we've been praised for carrying. Third, relearning rest. Not as laziness, not as quitting, not as a failure, but as discipline, as practice, as a sacred invitation. Relearning rest means trusting that we are worthy, even when we are still, that our value doesn't evaporate when our productivity slows down, that God is just as present in our rest as He is in our striving. Rest becomes an act of faith, A way of saying, I believe my life has meaning beyond what I can produce. And maybe the purpose after work isn't about replacing one kind of labor with another. It's about allowing our identity to be reshaped, rooted not in output, but in presence, in becoming. As you listen to this, I wonder what's staring in you. Maybe you're retired, maybe you're burned out, maybe you're still working but already exhausted by the pace. Maybe you've noticed how uncomfortable it feels to slow down, how quickly guilt shows up when you rest, how easily you explain yourself when you choose not to do more. And if that's you, you're not alone. Take a moment and ask yourself, without judgment, without rushing to fix anything, who am I when I'm not producing? What parts of my identity were shaped by survival rather than calling? What would it look like to believe that my worth is already secure? You don't have to answer these questions today. You don't have to resolve them neatly. Sometimes reflection isn't about clarity. It's about permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to rest without explanation. Permission to trust that becoming doesn't stop just because work does. And maybe God isn't asking you to figure it out, only to stay present while He's doing something new. Let this moment breathe. To notice what you've been carrying and to remember that you are more than what you do. If you're navigating early retirement or any season where work no longer defines your days, these aren't steps to master or habits to perfect. They're simply ways to stay grounded while you're becoming. Create a soft rhythm, not a hectic schedule, not another system to perform well in. Just a gentle rhythm that gives your days a beginning, a middle, and an end. Something small that helps you feel anchored. A morning walk, a cup of coffee or tea in the quiet, a moment of prayer, a daily check-in with yourself. This isn't about control, it's about care. Because structure doesn't have to be strict to be supportive. Explore interest without expectations. Not turning it into an income, no pressure to be good at it, no need to justify the time. Let curiosity lead. Let joy exist without productivity attached to it. This is about remembering who you are when nothing needs to come from it. When you're not proving, producing, or preparing for the next thing. Just being present with what brings you life. Reframe purpose as presence. Purpose doesn't vanish when work ends. Sometimes it simply changes form. It can look like being available, being attentive, being fully present in your life as it is, not as it once was, or as you think it should be. Wholeness, not output, becomes the measure. Maybe this is the quiet work of this season. Allowing your identity to be reshaped, rooted not in what you produce, but in who you're becoming. And that leads us to this week's quiet question. Questions, actually. What feels hardest to lay down right now? Where is rest still asking for my trust? What would it look like to believe that your worth is already secure? You don't have to resolve any of this today. Just notice. Let it be a beginning. Let me say this clearly and slowly. You are more than your job title, more than the roles you've carried, more than the weight you've learned how to hold. Your worth was never clocked in or clocked out. It was never dependent on how full your calendar was or how many people leaned on you. Rest is not failure. It is not giving up. It is not the end of your usefulness or your calling. Rest can be the place where the noise finally quiets enough for you to hear yourself again. The place where you remember who you are when no one is asking anything from you, when nothing needs to be explained, when you're simply allowed to be. This season is not about losing yourself. It's about meeting yourself again with more honesty, more softness, and more grace than you've ever been offered before. Thank you for spending this time with me, and thank you for listening with an open heart. If this episode spoke to you, consider sharing it with someone who's navigating a season they didn't plan for. Someone who might need permission to slow down too. In our next episode, we'll continue talking about identity and marriage, especially the parts we carry quietly, the ones we don't always get to name out loud. Until then, let yourself rest without explanation. You're not behind, you're not finished, you're becoming.